The plantation where no slave ever tried to escape. Perfect psychological slavery. They weren't chained. They weren't locked in. They weren't hunted. Yet on this plantation, no enslaved person ever tried to escape. Historians first called it mercy. The documents later revealed something far worse. History tells us one truth again and again. Where there was slavery, there was resistance. Where there was bondage, there were escape attempts. So when historians discovered records of a plantation where not a single enslaved person ever attempted to run, it sounded impossible. No chains broken, no midnight flights, no whispered plans of freedom, just silence. For decades, this plantation was cited as proof that slavery wasn't always brutal, that some masters were kind, that some enslaved people were content. But history doesn't work that way, because silence is not peace, and obedience is not consent. The plantation's name appeared ordinary in the archives. No dramatic legends, no famous rebellions, just neat ledgers, clean handwriting, and calm reports. Yet historians began to notice something strange. Too perfect. No punishments recorded, no escapes reported, no rewards for capture, no patrol expenses. In a system built on violence, this absence screamed louder than screams. So researchers dug deeper. Past official reports, past plantation journals, past public records. And what they uncovered would completely change how we understand control, fear, and survival under slavery. This wasn't a story of kindness. It was a story of something far more terrifying. The plantation sat far from major cities, surrounded by swamps, dense forests, and twisting waterways. On maps, it looked isolated. In reality, it was a trap. The land itself worked as a prison. The surrounding swamps were filled with venomous snakes. The rivers hid strong currents and alligators. The forests were thick enough to swallow sound, and people, even experienced trackers, avoided the area. But geography alone doesn't explain why no one even tried. Other plantations were isolated too, yet escape attempts still happened. So historians began examining the demographics. The enslaved population was unusually stable. Families were rarely separated. Children grew up beside parents. Generations lived and died on the same land. At first glance, this seemed humane. But control doesn't always come through whips. Sometimes it comes through attachments. Because when you give someone just enough to lose, you make escape feel like death. But there was something else, something more deliberate, something written in the margins of forgotten documents. The plantation owner was described as calm, soft-spoken, and orderly. No recorded outbursts, no public punishments, no chains displayed. Visitors praised his management style. He rarely raised his voice, rarely used overseers, rarely punished publicly. Instead, he ruled through rules. Rules that seemed fair, predictable, consistent. And consistency creates trust. But trust in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. He encouraged enslaved people to build homes, to plant gardens, to form families. He allowed religious gatherings, music, storytelling. Observers claimed the enslaved people appeared loyal, but appearance is a performance, especially under surveillance. What the records didn't show was what happened after dark. Years later, historians noticed something chilling. There were no medical expense records. None. No payments for treating injuries. No doctor visits. No recorded illnesses. On other plantations, medical costs were carefully logged because enslaved people were considered property. But here, nothing. Either no one was ever injured, or injuries were handled in a way that left no paper trail. Then came another discovery. Letters written by nearby plantation owners warned each other, do not interfere with his methods. Methods, that word changed everything. The plantation used psychological containment. Instead of constant violence, punishment was rare, but unforgettable. When it happened, it wasn't public. People would disappear for days. They would return changed. Silent, compliant, eyes empty. No scars were recorded, but trauma leaves marks ink can't capture, and fear spreads faster than rebellion. Escape usually meant leaving loved ones behind. Here, families were allowed to stay together. That wasn't kindness. It was leverage. Run and your family would suffer. Stay and they would live. This created an invisible fence stronger than iron. The master promised freedom. Not now, not soon, but someday. Good behavior was rewarded with privileges. Privileges created hope. Hope delayed rebellion, and delayed rebellion often dies quietly. Religion was permitted but carefully shaped. Freedom was preached as spiritual, not physical. Obedience was framed as virtue. Suffering was framed as divine purpose. This wasn't faith. It was conditioning. Here's the truth. Attempts may have happened. They just weren't documented, because reporting an escape would raise questions, and questions threatened the plantation's reputation. Silence was safer. Years after abolition, interviews with formerly enslaved descendants revealed the truth. People didn't run because they believed escape was impossible. Not physically, mentally. They were trained to survive, not to hope. When slavery officially ended, something unexpected happened. Many formerly enslaved people did not leave. Not immediately, not eagerly, not in celebration. Freedom arrived, but it felt unreal. Generations had been raised to believe survival depended on staying. Leaving meant danger, uncertainty, death. Freedom required decision-making, trust, and confidence, all of which had been systematically stripped away. Former masters offered contracts, low wages, familiar routines, and familiarity felt safer than freedom. To outside observers, this looked like loyalty. In truth, it was conditioning. Historians later described this phenomenon as learned dependence. But that phrase feels too clean. What actually existed was psychological imprisonment that outlived slavery itself. Children born on the plantation never heard stories of escape. No legends of heroes, no whispered myths of freedom, only cautionary tales. People who ran were never seen again. Freedom is a lie told by outsiders. The world beyond kills. Fear was passed down like inheritance. Not through violence, but through stories. By the time these children grew into adults, escape wasn't a choice. It wasn't even an idea. The plantation owner understood one thing perfectly. You don't need chains if you control belief. Pain creates resistance. Fear creates obedience. But belief creates permanence. He built a system where enslaved people policed themselves. Breaking rules didn't just bring punishment. It brought shame. And shame is stronger than force. Rebellions require trust. Trust that others will join you. Trust that risk is worth it. Trust that tomorrow might be better. This plantation destroyed trust by design. Privileges were individualized. Rewards were selective. Hope was personalized. Unity never formed. Isolation existed even in crowds. When outsiders visited, they saw calm workers, orderly fields, quiet obedience. They mistook absence of chaos for peace. But peace enforced through fear is not peace. It's compliance, and compliance looks beautiful until you understand the cost. For decades, this plantation was cited as evidence that slavery could be benign. Textbooks repeated the claim. Speeches quoted it. Propaganda embraced it, all based on incomplete records and deliberate omission. History was edited by those who benefited from the lie. When descendants finally spoke, their words were chilling. They taught us how to survive, not how to live. We were afraid of freedom. Escape felt like betrayal. These weren't excuses, they were symptoms. Experts later identified the system as coercive control, the same pattern used in cults, abusive relationships, totalitarian states, control perception, control fear, control hope, and people will imprison themselves. This plantation is not an exception. It is a warning, because systems like this didn't disappear. They evolved. Today, control rarely looks violent. It looks normal, professional, legal. People stay in harmful systems not because they must, but because they believe they have no alternative. That belief is the real cage. The most dangerous myth is not that slavery was cruel. It's the myth that cruelty is the only way to enslave. Before anyone runs, they must believe escape is possible. This plantation destroyed that belief. Perfectly. No rebellion, no bloodshed, no headlines, just lives slowly shaped into submission, and silence mistaken for peace. The truth wasn't hidden, it was ignored. Because it challenged comforting narratives, and uncomfortable truths are often buried, not lost. They didn't stay because they were loyal. They didn't stay because they were treated well. They stayed because freedom had been trained out of them. This plantation didn't break bodies. It broke belief. And history must never confuse silence with consent.